He discovered her betrayal when she handed him divorce papers across the oak table they once chose together, a silent confession of 6 months spent with another man. But the end of his marriage wasn't the end of his story. Brandon Atkinson, the quiet grocery manager who sacrificed his dreams for family, uncovered a treasure that would change his life forever. His wife traded stability for an illusion. Brandon chose reinvention. With newfound wealth and purpose, he rebuilt his world, thriving in a way no one, including her, could have imagined. And then, he disappeared. It was this extraordinary story that featured in the film and was named Best Picture under the films, including Best CGI. But before we dive into the twists and turns of this gripping tale, let me know where you're reading from in the comments below. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new one. The kitchen was unusually quiet for a Saturday morning. The warm Alabama sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting soft patterns on the table where Brandon Atkinson sat. It was the same table he and Riley had picked out together over 2 decades ago, a sturdy oak piece that had weathered countless family meals, late-night talks, and occasional arguments. Today, however, the table felt like a barrier, an unyielding divider between him and Riley, who sat across from him. Her hands were clasped around a manila envelope, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against its edge. Brandon glanced at her, noting how little she seemed to have changed in the 25 years they'd been married. Her light brown hair still gleamed, styled neatly as if she had just stepped out of a salon. She wore a simple but flattering outfit, her athletic frame a testament to the jogging habit she'd picked up in recent years. She looked like the picture of calm confidence, but there was a faint tension in the way she pressed her lips together. For Brandon, the moment felt surreal. He'd clocked countless hours managing the local grocery store, built a snug life with Riley, and raised their twin daughters, Alice and Rachel, who were now thriving at Columbia University. The life they had built together wasn't glamorous, but it was solid. Or so he had thought. "Brandon," Riley said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm but firm, the way someone might speak when bracing themselves for a difficult task. She slid the envelope toward him. "What's this?" he asked, his voice steady but low, a sinking feeling already forming in his chest. "Divorce papers," she replied matter-of-factly. "But don't need to give." For a moment, Brandon didn't move. The words hung in the air, heavy and foreign. He blinked, his mind scrambling to process what she had just said. "Divorce?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." Riley's tone softened, but she didn't waver. "I've thought about this for a long time. It's not because of anything you did. You've been a good husband, Brandon. A great father." Brandon stared at the envelope. The words, "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage," printed in bold on its front. His mind flashed through memories. The day he and Riley first met in high school, their modest wedding, late nights spent rocking the girls to sleep, and the countless small joys they'd shared over the years. None of it seemed to add up to this moment. Brandon leaned back in his chair, his gaze flicking between Riley and the envelope. "I don't understand," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "Why now, after everything, after all these years?" Riley exhaled deeply, her composure faltering for a moment. "It's not about you, Brandon. You've done everything right. But I've found someone else." The admission hit him like a blow. His jaw tightened, and his hands instinctively clenched the edge of the table. "Someone else," he repeated, the words laced with disbelief. "Yes," she said, meeting his eyes with a steady gaze. "His name is Derek Grant. He's a real estate developer. We've been seeing each other for 6 months." Brandon's chest tightened as the room seemed to close in around him. The image of their life together, the house, the family photos on the walls, the shared dreams, shattered like glass. "You're leaving me for him?" he asked, his voice low and strained. Riley hesitated, her resolve softening for a brief moment. "It's not that simple. Derek, he's ambitious. He has this drive, this passion for life. I admire that about him. And I need more, Brandon. I need to feel alive again. Brandon shook his head, struggling to comprehend her words. I turned down promotions. For you. For the girls. I stayed in this town because I thought it's what we wanted. What you wanted. Was that a mistake? Riley sighed, her eyes brimming with a mix of regret and determination. It wasn't a mistake. You were perfect, Brandon. Too perfect. But sometimes, perfection isn't enough. The silence that followed was deafening. Brandon looked down at the envelope, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He felt betrayed, blindsided, and utterly powerless. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Riley replied softly. The papers are straightforward. You'll keep the house, the cars, and all the money in our joint accounts. I don't want anything except a fresh start. Brandon looked up at her, his eyes searching for something, anything, that might explain how they had reached this point. But Riley's expression was resolute, her decision final. Just sign the papers, she said, her voice gentle but firm. Let's not make this harder than it has to be. Brandon sat there for a long moment, the weight of the moment sinking in. The life he had built, the sacrifices he had made, the love he had poured into his marriage. It all seemed to unravel before him. And yet, in Riley's eyes, he saw no malice, only a quiet determination to move on. I'll sign them, he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. But I need time to process this. Riley nodded, standing up and gathering her things. Take all the time you need. As she walked out of the kitchen, Brandon remained at the table, staring at the envelope. The sun continued to filter through the curtains, casting long shadows on the walls. For the first time in years, the house felt unbearably empty. Brandon first saw Riley during his junior year of high school, standing under the bleachers at a football game. She was laughing with her friends, her light brown hair catching the stadium lights, and he couldn't look away. Back then, Riley was the kind of girl everyone noticed, confident, outgoing, and full of life. To his surprise, she noticed him too, the quiet kid who preferred reading about supply chains and market trends to throwing a football. Their first date was at a small diner just outside their Alabama town. Riley talked about her dreams of seeing the world, and Brandon, ever practical, shared his plans to build a stable life. Despite their differences, they fit together seamlessly, balancing each other out. Riley brought excitement into Brandon's life while he grounded her, offering the sense of security she didn't know she craved. By senior year, they were inseparable. They attended prom together, where Brandon nervously fumbled through a proposal to take their relationship further after graduation. Riley laughed and told him he didn't need to overthink things. They had time, she said, but deep down, she already knew she wanted to build her life with him. Marriage came a few years later, followed by the arrival of their twin daughters, Alice and Rachel. Raising the girls became their shared purpose. Brandon took a job at the local grocery store, quickly rising to manager. The hours were long, but he came home every evening to a warm dinner and Riley's bright smile. Their modest home, nestled in an Alabama suburb, became their haven, filled with laughter, school projects, and the sound of piano lessons gone awry. The girls grew up strong and ambitious, eventually leaving for Columbia University. Riley and Brandon cheered them on as they packed their bags, though the silence they left behind brought an unspoken tension into the house. Brandon often reflected on the choices he'd made. Early in his career, he had opportunities to relocate, take on corporate roles, or even run his own chain of stores. But each time, he turned them down. It's not worth uprooting the girls, he'd say, confident that keeping the family together was the right decision. He poured himself into providing for his family, often working late and picking up extra shifts during the holidays. His dedication extended beyond work. He was the dad who stayed up helping with science fair projects, who taught the girls how to ride their bikes, and who never missed a single parent-teacher conference. He took pride in his role as a provider and protector, believing it was enough to keep their family strong. But for Riley, Brandon's steadfastness sometimes felt like stagnation. While she admired his loyalty and work ethic, she couldn't ignore the growing itch for something more. She had imagined a life full of adventures, driven by ambition and daring choices. Instead, they'd built a life defined by routine. Riley never doubted Brandon's love for her or the girls. He was everything a husband should be: faithful, respectful, dependable. But as the years passed, she felt as though she were living in the shadow of his sacrifices, her own dreams quietly set aside. When the girls left for college, the cracks in their marriage began to show. The shared focus on family that had once held them together now highlighted the gulf between them. Riley took up jogging and began spending more time outside the house, searching for something to fill the void. Though she never voiced her feelings, Riley began to resent the life they'd built, not for its comforts, but for the dreams she felt she had traded away. The clinking of Riley's spoon against her coffee cup was the only sound in the room. Brandon sat across from her, the divorce papers still resting on the table. He hadn't touched them yet, his hands folded tightly in front of him. "I think you owe me an explanation," Brandon said finally, his voice steadier than he felt. Riley hesitated, her eyes flickering to the papers before returning to his. "You're right," she admitted. "You deserve to know the truth." Brandon's chest tightened. He braced himself, but nothing could prepare him for what came next. "I've been seeing someone else," she said softly, the words slicing through the air like a blade. The room felt like it had tilted on its axis. Brandon blinked, the weight of her confession making it hard to breathe. "Seeing someone?" he repeated, disbelief lacing his tone. "Yes," Riley continued, her voice firmer now, as if forcing herself to push through. "His name is Derek Grant. He's a real estate developer." "And how long has this been going on?" Brandon asked, his voice low, barely controlled. 6 months, Riley admitted, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "It wasn't planned, Brandon. I didn't go looking for this. It just happened." Brandon let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "It just happened? That's what you're going with?" Riley flinched, but held her ground. "I know it sounds awful. I'm not proud of what I've done. But Derek, he's different. He has this energy, this ambition. He makes me feel..." "Alive?" Brandon interrupted, his voice sharp. "Is that what you were going to say?" Riley nodded, her expression pained. "Yes. I know it's not fair to you, but I can't ignore how I feel anymore." Brandon leaned forward, his voice rising despite himself. "You can't ignore how you feel? What about me, Riley? What about the life we built? Does that mean nothing to you?" "Of course it means something," Riley said, her voice breaking. "You've been a wonderful husband, Brandon. Truly. But I've changed. I need more than this." "So, what's the plan?" Brandon asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. "You ride off into the sunset with this Derek guy and leave me here with a stack of papers?" Riley straightened, her resolve hardening. "I'm moving in with him. He has a place overlooking the river. It's what I want." Brandon stared at her, the woman he had loved for over 2 decades, and for the first time she felt like a stranger. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in around Brandon as Riley's words sank deeper into his mind. He couldn't believe it. The woman who had stood by his side through everything was now confessing to a betrayal he had never imagined. "Do you even hear yourself, Riley?" Brandon asked, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "You're throwing away 25 years. For what? A man you've known for 6 months?" "It's not just about Derek," Riley said, her voice quiet but steady. "It's about me. About what I need." "And what about what I need?" Brandon shot back. "I gave up promotions, opportunities, everything, because I thought we were in this together. Was I wrong?" Riley's face softened, guilt flickering in her eyes. "No, Brandon, you weren't wrong. You did everything right." "That's what makes this so hard." "Hard for you," Brandon said bitterly. "You're not the one being blindsided. You've had 6 months to process this. 6 months to plan your escape, and now you want me to just accept it?" "I'm not asking you to accept it," Riley said, her voice firm but tinged with sadness. "I'm asking you to let me go." Brandon stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the tile floor. He paced the room, his hands running through his hair. "I can't believe this," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "All these years, and this is how it ends?" Riley stood as well, crossing her arms over her chest. "It's not easy for me either, Brandon," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I hate that I'm hurting you, but staying in this marriage would hurt us both even more." Brandon stopped pacing and turned to face her. "You know what hurts the most?" he said, his voice quieter now, but no less pained. "It's not just that you cheated. It's that you didn't even try to talk to me first, to fix this." "I didn't know how," Riley admitted, tears glistening in her eyes. "And maybe, deep down, I didn't want to." "I'm sorry, Brandon." The sincerity in her voice was undeniable, but it did little to ease the ache in Brandon's chest. He looked at her one last time, the woman he thought he knew, and felt the weight of her words settle like a stone. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Riley standing alone. The quiet click of the door closing behind him marked the end of an era, a marriage built on love and trust, now reduced to memories and a signed set of papers. Brandon sat at the kitchen table late into the night, the divorce papers finally signed and sealed. The room was eerily silent, but his thoughts were loud and chaotic. Despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him, he felt a faint, unfamiliar sense of clarity. The life he had known for 25 years was gone, but now he had a choice: to cling to what was lost or to start over. The next morning, Brandon woke up early, determined to take the first steps toward rebuilding his life. His first task was practical but symbolic: selling Riley's Subaru. She had left it behind, opting to move in with Derek and his luxury sedan. Brandon drove the car to the dealership where they had bought it years ago. It fetched a modest price, but that wasn't what mattered. Watching the dealer hand over the check felt like the first tangible sign of moving forward. Back home, he began the daunting process of clearing out the house. Riley's absence was glaring. Half-empty closets and barren bathroom counters served as daily reminders of what was no longer there. Brandon tackled the task systematically, filling bags with her leftover belongings and boxing up items for donation. The wedding photos, anniversary mementos, and other personal keepsakes posed the greatest challenge. While Brandon had been the one to admit it, it was always the keeps that had been most disruptive. After a long pause, he made a decision. He kept the family pictures that featured their daughters, but discarded anything that spoke solely of their marriage. As the days passed, the house became less of a shared space and more of his own. With a clearer vision of the future, Brandon reached out to Max, an old friend and real estate agent. Max, ever the optimist, agreed to help sell the house quickly. "We'll price it right and make it attractive," Max promised during a brief phone call. The idea of leaving the house behind felt bittersweet, but Brandon knew it was necessary. Meanwhile, he tackled financial logistics with equal determination. He opened new bank accounts, canceled all shared credit cards, and ensured Riley's name was removed from everything. He even contacted the phone company to disconnect her line and transfer full ownership of the account to himself. These small but significant actions reinforced his commitment to moving forward. A few weekends later, Brandon hosted a yard sale, clearing out years of accumulated belongings. The event was equal parts cathartic and surreal. Neighbors stopped by, offering both sympathy and casual small talk. By the end of the day, the driveway was empty, and the house felt lighter, stripped of its old baggage, both literal and metaphorical. With the yard sale earnings added to his growing accounts, Brandon began considering his next steps. A 3-month vacation, something he'd postponed for years, now seemed like the perfect opportunity to reflect and reset. One evening, Brandon sat on the couch, his phone resting heavily in his hand. The hardest part of all this wasn't signing the divorce papers or packing up the house. It was breaking the news to Alice and Rachel. After a long pause, he dialed Alice's number. "Hey, Dad," Alice's cheerful voice answered on the other end. "How's everything back home?" "Yeah." Brandon hesitated, then took a deep breath. "It's fine, honey, but I wanted to talk to you and Rachel about something important." "Is everything okay?" Alice asked, her tone shifting to concern. "It's about your mom and me," Brandon began, keeping his voice steady. "We've decided to separate. And when we separated—" A long silence followed, and Brandon could hear Alice's breathing on the other end. Finally, she said, "Separate? Like divorce?" "Yes," Brandon confirmed. "It's mutual. We've both agreed it's the best decision for us." "Does Rachel know?" Alice asked. "Not yet," Brandon admitted. "I was hoping you could help me break the news to her." "Sure," Alice said softly. "But Dad, are you okay?" "I will be," Brandon replied, trying to sound confident. "This doesn't change how much we love you girls. Your mom and I just grew apart." When Rachel joined the call, the conversation followed a similar pattern. Both daughters were initially shocked, but ultimately supportive. "Are you sure you're okay, Dad?" Rachel asked, echoing her sister's concern. "I am," he assured them. "And I'm proud of both of you. That won't ever change." Before they hung up, Alice added, "If you need anything, just call us, okay? We're here for you, Dad." Their words of support were a balm to Brandon's aching heart. As he set the phone down, he felt a renewed sense of determination. He hadn't just lost a marriage. He had gained a chance to rediscover himself. And his daughter's faith in him gave him the strength to begin. The air was crisp and cool as Brandon made his way up the uneven trail at Hayes Ridge, a sprawling 2,000-acre expanse of forest and hills managed by the local land trust. Armed with his GPS and a metal detector slung over his shoulder, he felt a rare sense of calm. Geocaching had always been his escape, a way to clear his mind and focus on the thrill of the hunt. Today's search was for one of the oldest survey markers in the area, rumored to be hidden deep in the forest. After nearly an hour of navigating dense underbrush and dodging patches of poison ivy, the soft beep of the metal detector cut through the stillness. Brandon crouched, brushing away layers of dirt and leaves, uncovering a weathered brick monument embedded in the ground. A small bronze plaque confirmed it as the marker he'd been searching for. Grinning with satisfaction, he took a quick photo before packing up to move on. Just as he stood, the metal detector emitted another faint signal. Curiosity piqued, Brandon retraced his steps and scanned the area once more. The signal grew stronger a few feet from the marker. Kneeling again, he dug carefully, his fingers scraping against something solid. After several minutes of work, he unearthed a small iron box wrapped in oil-soaked canvas. The box was heavy, its surface rusted but intact. Brandon's pulse quickened as he examined it. It didn't look like a modern item. Its craftsmanship suggested it was decades, if not centuries, old. Back at home, Brandon set the box on his kitchen table. He hesitated for a moment, debating whether to report the find to the land trust. But his curiosity got the better of him. With a pair of bolt cutters, he carefully snapped the lock and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled beneath layers of aged cloth, were 12 large cent coins, each gleaming as though untouched by time. Brandon's breath caught in his throat as he gently removed them. These weren't just ordinary coins. They were immaculate, their intricate designs and inscriptions still sharp. For a moment, Brandon simply stared at the coins, his mind racing. He didn't know much about large cents beyond what he'd read in an old book his grandfather had left him. Still, He knew enough to realize this was no ordinary discovery. That evening, Brandon dug out the dusty book from his grandfather's collection, The Mysteries of the Penny. He hadn't opened it in years, but now he turned its pages with renewed interest, comparing the illustrations to the coins spread before him. Each coin was a large cent, minted between 1793 and 1857, their size and craftsmanship distinct from modern pennies. Brandon's magnifying glass revealed incredible details: mint marks, flawless edges, and rare varieties he'd only ever read about. One coin in particular caught his eye: a 1793 chain cent, the first official coin struck by the U.S. Mint. It was pristine, an almost impossible find in such condition. With a growing sense of awe, Brandon spent hours researching the coins online. Auction records and collector forums painted a clear picture. These coins were rare, and in their condition, they were worth an extraordinary amount of money. Estimates for similar coins ranged from tens of thousands to millions of dollars. "This can't be real," Brandon muttered to himself, double-checking his findings. But the evidence was undeniable. Each coin was a treasure in its own right, and together they represented a life-changing windfall. The discovery sent a jolt of energy through him, replacing the numbness that had followed his divorce. For the first time in months, Brandon felt a spark of excitement about the future. He wasn't just holding a box of coins. He was holding the key to a new chapter in his life. Determined to protect his find, Brandon placed the coins in a secure container and began researching reputable dealers and auction houses. The quiet grocery store manager who had spent years putting his family first was now stepping into a world of rare collectibles and high-stakes negotiations. For the first time, the possibilities ahead felt limitless. The towering skyscrapers of New York City seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky as Brandon stepped into the sleek glass building housing Adams & Burns, one of the most prestigious auction houses in the country. Clutching his portfolio of photos and documentation, he couldn't help but feel a mix of nerves and excitement. This was a world far removed from the grocery store aisles and quiet Alabama suburbs he was used to. A sharply dressed receptionist led him to a private office where Leo Adams, the firm's co-founder, greeted him with a warm handshake. "Mr. Atkinson, welcome to Adams & Burns. I hear you've brought us something extraordinary." "Thank you," Brandon replied, sitting across from Leo. He laid out high-resolution images of 4 coins from his collection, each meticulously labeled with its details. Leo examined the photos carefully, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to open admiration. "These are remarkable," he said, gesturing to a particularly pristine 1793 chain cent. "The condition alone makes them rare, but this is museum quill." Brandon allowed himself a small smile. "I thought so too. That's why I'm here. I'd like to sell these 4 coins, but I have one condition." More aside, Leo raised an eyebrow. "And what might that be?" Brandon slid a letter across the table. "I'd like Adams & Burns to purchase a piece of land in Alabama and donate it to the local land trust. It's priced at $600,000. The proceeds from this sale should cover it." The room fell silent as Leo read the letter, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up. "That's an unusual request." "I know," Brandon admitted. "But the land trust is preserving something special, and this would secure their efforts for years to come. You'll get a tax benefit, and I'll know the land is safe." Leo leaned back, studying Brandon. "You drive a hard bargain, Mr. Atkinson, but it's a compelling pitch." After a moment, Leo nodded. "We'll proceed, on the condition that these coins meet our appraiser's standards." "They will," Brandon replied confidently. As they finalized the details, a new figure entered the room. Adelaide Langley, the firm's co-owner, extended a perfectly manicured hand to Brandon. Her presence was striking, confident, poised, and effortlessly elegant. "Mr. Atkinson," she said with a warm smile, "it's a pleasure to meet you. I've heard wonderful things about your collection." Her tone was friendly, but there was an unmistakable air of authority in the way she spoke. Brandon shook her hand, surprised by how quickly she put him at ease. The next morning, Brandon was surprised to receive a call from Adelaide. "Mr. Atkinson," she said, her voice light, "would you have time to join me for coffee before your flight back to Alabama? There's something I'd like to discuss." Curious, he agreed. They met at a chic cafe near Central Park, where Adelaide cut straight to the point. "I believe you're underestimating the significance of your coins. An offshore account might be the safest way to manage the proceeds." Brandon hesitated. "An offshore account? Isn't that complicated?" "Not at all," Adelaide assured him. "It's about security and discretion, especially with assets of this value. If you're interested, I'd be happy to guide you through the process. I'm headed to the Cayman Islands tomorrow for business and could arrange for you to join me." The offer caught him off guard, but there was something compelling about Adelaide's confidence. Before he knew it, he was boarding a first-class flight to the Caymans, seated beside her. The trip was equal parts business and pleasure. Adelaide's sharp wit and deep knowledge of finance made their meetings productive, while her light-hearted charm turned meals into moments of genuine connection. Over fresh seafood and tropical cocktails, they shared stories of their lives, hers filled with high-stakes deals and international travel, his rooted in the simple joys of family and routine. One evening, as they stood on the balcony of her oceanfront condo, Adelaide turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You're different from the people I usually work with, Brandon. Most are all about the next big deal. But you're grounded." Brandon chuckled. "Grounded sounds like a polite way of saying boring." She shook her head, smiling. "Not boring, genuine. It's refreshing." For the first time in months, Brandon felt seen. Not as a grocery store manager or a divorced man starting over, but as someone with value beyond his circumstances. Spencer loved his body, and he loved branding people the way it did. But a few years later, Brandon got sick. By the time they returned to New York, the offshore account was set up, and so was an unspoken bond between them. As Adelaide walked him to his cab, she handed him a key. "For my spare room," she said casually. "If you ever decide to move to New York." Brandon watched her walk away, feeling both daunted and invigorated. The future was no longer just a blank slate. It was a canvas waiting for him to make his mark. Back in Alabama, Brandon sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee in hand, reviewing the final transaction documents from Adams and Burns. The sale of the 4 coins had gone through without a hitch, and the proceeds, now safely stored in his offshore account, represented a level of wealth he'd never imagined having. For years, his life had revolved around budgets, bills, and careful planning. Now, for the first time, he had financial freedom, and with it, a growing sense of empowerment. The discovery and sale of the coins had sparked something within Brandon that he hadn't felt in years: ambition. He began researching more about coin collecting, exploring online forums, and connecting with reputable dealers to learn how to maximize the value of the remaining pieces in his collection. Late into the night, he would scroll through listings, his newfound hobby blending seamlessly with a budding entrepreneurial spirit. His growing financial stability allowed him to make decisions without hesitation. He sold his Alabama home at a fair price thanks to Max's help, and began planning his move to New York. The transition felt less like running away and more like stepping toward something bigger. Each small step built upon the last, fueling Brandon's confidence. He updated his wardrobe, swapping worn-out flannels for tailored shirts and slacks, and began to see himself in a new light. He wasn't just a grocery manager anymore. He was someone capable of navigating high-stakes deals, managing wealth, and carving out a future on his terms. The community around him started to notice the change. Neighbors who had once viewed Brandon as unassuming and predictable now stopped him at the store or during yard sales, commenting on how different he seemed. More self-assured, even ambitious. While he appreciated their kind words, Brandon knew the transformation wasn't for anyone else. It was for him. Adelaide's presence had also left a lasting impact on Brandon. Though their time together had been brief, Her confidence and unapologetic approach to life had opened his eyes to possibilities he'd never considered. She had a way of encouraging him without outright pushing, allowing him to arrive at his own decisions while subtly steering him in the right direction. "Why settle for what's comfortable when you're capable of so much more?" she had asked him over dinner in New York. The question lingered in his mind, nudging him every time he doubted himself. Brandon found himself adopting some of Adelaide's traits, not her polished sophistication, but her belief in pursuing what truly mattered. He started setting clear goals for himself, something he hadn't done in years. He wanted to grow his knowledge of coin collecting, take risks, and explore interests he had set aside during his years of focusing solely on his family. Her words had a way of cutting through his self-doubt. During one phone call, she remarked, "You're more resourceful than you realize, Brandon. Don't let anyone, not even yourself, convince you otherwise." With Adelaide's encouragement echoing in his mind, Brandon leaned into this new chapter of his life. He booked his move to New York, where he planned to stay in Adelaide's spare room while figuring out his next steps. The thought of leaving everything familiar behind was daunting, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a gamble. It felt like growth. As Brandon packed up the last of his belongings, he caught his reflection in the mirror. There was something different in his posture, his expression, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. He smiled, realizing that this wasn't just about money or ambition. It was about becoming the man he was always meant to be. The cracks in Derek Grant's empire began to show just months after Riley moved in with him. Riverfront development, once lauded for its ambitious real estate projects, faced mounting delays and financial shortfalls. The grand apartment overlooking the river, the sleek BMW, and the exclusive social gatherings were all funded by precarious loans and over-leveraged assets. At first, Riley remained unaware of the growing crisis. Derek was charming and confident, always brushing off concerns with promises of a turnaround. "It's just a cash flow issue," he would say, waving away her questions with a dismissive smile. But the signs began harder to ignore. Contractors began pulling out of deals, creditors started making demands, and whispers of financial trouble crept into their once glamorous social circle. Riley's world unraveled further when Derek's creditors filed lawsuits, freezing his assets and leaving him cornered. One morning, she woke to find his belongings packed and a hastily scribbled note on the counter. "I need to step away for a bit," it read. "Don't worry, I'll figure this out." But Derek never returned. The reality of her situation hit Riley like a freight train. She was left stranded in a city where she had few friends and no financial security. The apartment, leased under Derek's name, was repossessed within weeks. Her parents, though sympathetic, were unable to help, beyond offering advice she didn't want to hear. Her pride prevented her from reaching out to her daughters, who had already expressed their doubts about Derek. For the first time in years, Riley felt utterly alone. The life she had envisioned when she left Brandon now seemed like a cruel joke. The stability she had taken for granted during her marriage was gone, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty about her future. It was a humid afternoon when Riley showed up at Brandon's doorstep, unannounced. He had just finished packing the last of his belongings for his move to New York. Seeing her there, clutching her purse and looking uncharacteristically unsure of herself, caught him off guard. "Riley," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "This is a surprise." "Can I come in?" she asked, hesitantly. Brandon nodded, stepping aside to let her in. The house was nearly empty, its bare walls and stacked boxes a clear sign of his impending departure. Riley glanced around, her eyes lingering on the changes. "You're leaving?" "I am," Brandon said simply. "New York." She nodded, fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "I heard about the coins. You've done well for yourself." Brandon raised an eyebrow. "Why are you here, Riley?" She hesitated, then sighed. I need help, Brandon." There it was, the admission she had likely struggled to make. Brandon crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Help with what?" "Derek's gone," she said quietly. her voice tinged with a mix of shame and desperation. "He left me with nothing. I don't know where else to turn." Brandon studied her for a long moment. The woman standing before him was a far cry from the confident, self-assured Riley he had once known. She looked tired, defeated. But despite the pang of sympathy he felt, he couldn't ignore the bitterness that lingered beneath the surface. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, his tone polite but distant. Riley looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "That's it? After everything we've been through, you're just going to brush me off?" Brandon took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Riley, I spent years putting your needs above mine. I sacrificed opportunities because I thought we were building something together. But you made it clear that wasn't enough for you." "That's not fair," she said, her voice breaking. "I made a mistake, Brandon. I see that now." "It's not about fairness," Brandon replied evenly. "It's about moving forward. I've found a new direction for my life and I can't go backward." Riley looked as though she might protest, but instead she simply nodded. "I understand," she said softly. As she turned to leave, Brandon felt a twinge of guilt, but knew he had made the right choice. He had spent too long living for others. This time, he was choosing himself. The days leading up to Brandon's move were a whirlwind of activity. The house sale had gone through smoothly thanks to Max's diligence, and the new owners were eager to take possession. With the proceeds safely deposited in his account, Brandon focused on clearing out the last remnants of his life in Alabama. Boxes lined the walls of the near-empty house, each carefully labeled and ready for the movers. Brandon found a certain satisfaction in the process. It felt like shedding the weight of his past and making room for something new. As he packed, he came across an old photo album filled with pictures of Alice and Rachel growing up. Flipping through the pages, he smiled at the memories, but felt no pang of regret. He had given them a stable childhood, and now it was time to focus on himself. Alice and Rachel surprised him with a visit the weekend before his departure. They brought their usual mix of energy and warmth, immediately filling the house with life. "Dad, this is incredible," Alice said, surveying the organized chaos of packed boxes. "You're really doing it." "I am," Brandon replied with a small smile. Rachel hugged him tightly. "We're so proud of you," she said. "This can't have been easy." "It wasn't," Brandon admitted. "But it's the right move." They spent the day helping him tie up loose ends, sorting through a few last-minute items and taking a walk around the neighborhood where they had grown up. As the sun began to set, they sat together on the front porch, sharing stories and laughter. "You've shown us what it means to keep moving forward," Alice said, her tone serious for once. "That's a lesson we won't forget." Brandon nodded, his chest swelling with pride. Knowing his daughters admired his resilience was a greater reward than anything money could buy. When Brandon's phone buzzed that evening, it was Adelaide. Her voice, as always, carried an effortless confidence. "Brandon, are you ready for the big move?" she asked. "Almost," he replied. "Just wrapping up a few things." "Good. I've arranged for the movers to drop your things off at my apartment. The spare room is ready, and I expect you to make yourself at home." Brandon chuckled. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," Adelaide said, a touch of playfulness in her tone. "You're starting a new chapter, and you'll have a front row seat to the greatest city in the world. What's not to love?" Though Brandon had initially been hesitant about accepting her offer, he now felt a sense of anticipation. Adelaide's invitation wasn't just about logistics. It symbolized the bond they had built and the potential for something deeper. As the movers loaded the last of his belongings, Brandon stood outside his Alabama home for the final time. The years of memories, both joyful and painful, felt like a chapter in a book that had reached its conclusion. By the time he boarded the flight to New York, Brandon wasn't just leaving behind a house, he was leaving behind the man he used to be. The city waiting for him represented possibility, growth, and perhaps a chance at something entirely unexpected. When he landed, Adelaide was waiting for him at the terminal, her presence as reassuring as ever. As they walked together toward the bustling streets of Manhattan, Brandon felt a renewed sense of purpose. His journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. Brandon stood on the balcony of Adelaide's apartment, a glass of wine in hand, gazing out at the city lights that stretched endlessly before him. New York pulsed with energy, a stark contrast to the quiet suburbs of Alabama he had left behind. It was a city of ambition and reinvention, and for the first time in years, Brandon felt like he belonged. Reflecting on the past few months, he marveled at how far he had come. The heartbreak of Riley's betrayal had once seemed insurmountable, but now it felt like a distant memory. He had taken control of his life in ways he never thought possible, discovering a hidden treasure, making bold financial moves, and leaving behind a life that no longer served him. The pain of his divorce had forced Brandon to confront the parts of himself he had ignored for years. For so long, he had defined his worth by his ability to provide for others, sacrificing his own dreams in the process. But now, he was learning to prioritize himself, to embrace the risks and rewards of forging a new path. His days in New York were filled with opportunities to grow. He spent mornings researching coin markets and exploring auctions, afternoons walking through the city's museums and parks, and evenings sharing lively conversations with Adelaide over dinner. Each day felt like a step closer to the man he was becoming, a man defined not by his past, but by his potential. Brandon's transformation wasn't just about his circumstances. It was about reclaiming his identity and rediscovering the confidence he had lost over years of routine and compromise. The painful chapter he had closed in Alabama no longer defined him. It had become the foundation for something stronger. As Brandon settled into his new life, his bond with Adelaide grew stronger. What had started as a professional connection had blossomed into something deeper, though neither of them had rushed to define it. Adelaide's easy confidence and sharp intellect challenged Brandon in ways he hadn't experienced before, while his grounded nature seemed to bring her a sense of calm. One evening, as they sat together on her balcony, Adelaide turned to him with a thoughtful smile. "Do you ever think about what's next?" she asked, her tone curious. Brandon chuckled, swirling the wine in his glass. "Every day, but for once, I'm not rushing to figure it all out. I'm enjoying the ride." Her smile widened. "Good. You deserve that." Though Brandon was cautious about the idea of starting a new relationship, he couldn't deny the spark between them. Adelaide had become more than just a mentor or a friend. She was someone who saw him for who he truly was, not who he used to be. Professionally, Brandon's move to New York had opened doors he hadn't even known existed. His knowledge of coin collecting and auctions had already led to a few lucrative deals, and he was beginning to think about expanding his hobby into a full-fledged business. The city's endless resources and connections made anything seem possible. As the weeks turned into months, Brandon realized he wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. The man who had once doubted his worth had found a new sense of purpose, fueled by a combination of hard work, resilience, and the unexpected support of people like Adelaide and his daughters. For Brandon, the future wasn't just a blank slate. It was a canvas waiting to be filled with the bold, vibrant colors of a life well lived. And for the first time in years, he was ready to paint it.